I focus my practice on family-based immigration law. And recently there was an article posted by USCIS on their website explaining how they had investigated this massive marriage fraud scheme. And a bunch of people got arrested, a bunch of immigrants got their immigration status, their permanent residence revoked or rescinded more properly. And I want to just take this video to explain how that happened and to warn you against the dangers of marriage-based immigration fraud. In these crazy times where everyone's afraid, anyone who's an immigrant is afraid, even some US citizens are afraid, it's important to not get caught up and make a mistake that's gonna change the direction of your life. And one of those mistakes would be engaging in a fraudulent marriage. So let me just read a paragraph from this, and then I'll get into some of the practical considerations when you get married to somebody for an immigration benefit. So this article says, in April 2022, HSI Maryland's Document and Benefit Fraud Task Force, with assistance from USCIS, began investigating individuals suspected of entering sham marriages with foreign nationals to obtain immigration benefits. After investigation and interviews with petitioners and beneficiaries, USCIS determined that marriages were arranged by Ella Zoran, Tatiana Segal, and Alexandra Tuck, all residents of New York City. They were paid thousands of dollars for facilitating and coordinating sham weddings, including the preparation of false immigration forms and fake health status attestations in connection with applications for immigration benefits. And then they talk about someone else who got arrested, and then there's a quote from the USCIS officer. "Some marriages are made in heaven. Some are just made up," said USCIS spokesperson Matthew Tragesser. "Our work with ICE crushed a marriage fraud ring where US citizens were paid to marry aliens. Under Secretary Noem, fraudsters are walking out in handcuffs. Buying a spouse doesn't make you a citizen. Individuals involved have had their immigration benefits revoked as part of this investigation." So I've mentioned this in other videos, but I just want to run you through some practical considerations if this isn't enough to persuade you not to engage in a sham marriage. When you marry someone, first of all, you will attend at least one immigration interview with that person, and it might be 1 to 2 years after you marry them. And if you're not actually living together, it's gonna be hard to pass that interview. Not impossible. You hear stories of people who've done it, who got their immigration status through a sham marriage. My understanding is it used to be much easier. And to be honest, a couple times a year, I consult with somebody who has like no options, and they ask me, what if I marry someone? And a lot of the times what they're saying is, what if I pay someone to marry me, like and get in a sham marriage? Would that help me fix my immigration status? And I'll tell you exactly what I tell them. First of all, if USCIS makes a determination that you fraudulently married for an immigration benefit, it's game over. You're never gonna qualify for an immigration benefit ever again, even if you're in a legitimate marriage 20 years down the road. And you'll probably also get deported from the United States. So, not worth it just for that reason alone. But let's talk about it more practically. You get married, and let's say you are actually living together, and your interview is 1 year later. At that interview, let's assume everything goes well and they believe that you're in a good faith marriage, which is a big if. By the way, if it doesn't go well, they'll schedule a second interview, and that second interview will be 1 year later or more. I've seen it take 2 years for the second interview. And during that time, they can do a home visit. They could speak with your neighbors to see if you're both actually living there as spouses. And when you attend that second interview, it's gonna be a very hostile Stokes interview where they separate you, and they ask for hours, by the way. They'll speak with each spouse for more than an hour usually, and ask you like the same 100 to 300 questions to see if there are any major differences in your responses. And if you're really not living together, it will become clear at that Stokes interview. But let's say it doesn't get to the Stokes interview, and so 1 year after you get married and file your green card application, you guys attend the interview, and let's say it gets approved, which I assume happens sometimes. At that point, you'll be a conditional resident, which means 2 years later, you must submit 2 more years of evidence to prove that you continued to live together in a good faith marriage. So updated evidence of trips together. Hopefully you'll have some kids together at some point if that was in the cards. Joint tax returns together, 2 years of joint bank accounts, 2 years of additional leases, photographs of you guys with friends and family. There needs to be a substantial amount of evidence. And once you file that, which is at like the 3-year mark after you got married, so 1 year for the first interview and then 2 more years before you file this petition to remove conditions, it can take 1.5 to 4 years for that to get processed. So theoretically, this process could be like 7 years long. And I imagine that when an immigrant gets into a fraudulent marriage and pays a US citizen to engage in this fraud, they're not anticipating that this is going to go on for 7 years. I've heard of situations where that US citizen actually wants to get in a real marriage with their actual significant other during that time. And they don't care about like the 5 or 10 or 20 grand that you paid them 5 years ago. Like, as far as they're concerned, they fulfilled their obligation to you and they'll get divorced and marry their new spouse. When USCIS investigates, and I've heard of this happening many times, they will speak to the US citizen petitioner alone and put the pressure on. Like threaten the fine, the jail time, all sorts of consequences that can go away easily if they just write a short statement explaining how the marriage was entered into fraudulently or sign a pre-prepared statement to that effect. And so under that kind of pressure, you know, the odds of getting away with it are not very good. All right, guys, so I've said this before, I'm gonna say it again, don't get into fraudulent marriages. The consequences are not worth it, first of all. And second of all, practically speaking, it's difficult to pull off. And many people think it's much easier than it actually is, and it's much faster than it actually is. That's not actually true. And even in these situations where, you know, these people are helping orchestrate fraudulent marriages and they have an actual plan and they create this massive fraud, even in these situations, years later, you can have your green card rescinded. And by the way, down the road, after you naturalize, you can be denaturalized if it's determined that you obtained your naturalization through fraud. So if you want to live with that kind of fear for the rest of your life, I mean, that's a personal decision you're going to have to make, but don't expect a reputable immigration attorney to assist you with that process. Now, for those of you who aren't going to get into a sham marriage, if you need any assistance, I like to focus my practice on family-based immigration, and I particularly love handling marriage-based green card cases because people are in love, they're starting their lives together, and if it's a real marriage, those cases are pretty easy to win as long as you follow a couple rules and you prepare your case properly. So if you need any assistance with that, my information is in the video description below. If you're just interested in updates on immigration policy, changes to law, or just things that are happening under the Trump administration that affect immigrants, be sure to subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time for another video.